Last week, we talked with Brendan Scott and Dr. Tom LeGrand about sports stories. Why are sports stories so heartwarming and inspirational, even to people who don't like sports? And why do sports stories carry so much power to create social change? Welcome back to our table for the conclusion of that conversation. One of the best-known sports stories in our culture comes from the movie Chariots of Fire. It tells the fact-based story of two athletes in the 1924 Olympics. There was Eric Liddell, a devout Scottish Christian who runs for the glory of God, and there was Harold Abrahams, an English Jew who runs to overcome prejudice. That movie, which was released, I believe, in 1980, won 4 Academy Awards. It was nominated for 7. It ranked 19th in the British Film Institute's list of top 100 British films. Chariots of Fire was re-released in 2012, and this is what one critic, Kate Muir, said at the re-release. In a time when drug tests and synthetic fibers have replaced gumption and moral fiber, the tale of two runners competing against each other in the 1924 Olympics has a simple, undiminished power. From the opening scene of pale young men racing barefoot along the beach, full of hope and elation, backed by Vangelise's now famous anthem, the film is utterly compelling. Would a story like Chariots of Fire make it if it were released for the first time today in an age of drug tests and synthetic fibers, Brendan?
You know, that is just a good question. I look at what movies were like in the 80s, what they were like in the 90s, how storytelling has changed, and I say yes. And I know there are going to be people that disagree with me because I remember having a conversation with one of our former coworkers in Guatemala and him stating that movies don't last. I disagree. If it's got a good story, a good conflict in it, you can put it in your VCR, because that's what we had for Chariots of Fire, because we had it on VHS. Or you could put it, stream it on Netflix or wherever you can find it now, and it's going to capture an audience. When I was preparing for my cross-country team meeting this last Monday, I was going through inspirational YouTube clips to show them, and obviously Chariots of Fire came up. And I was like, I've got to show them this. And when I do, it's going to capture them because it's a story about heart, about sticking up for what you believe in, and it's going to inspire them. I mean, I didn't watch it for the first time until mid-1990s because, if it came out in 1980, I wasn't born yet, and I would not have been able to see it. And it captured me. It inspired me to want to run. And then I tried to run on the sand, and it's really hard.
100%. 100%.
Always when I'm running now, and I get to that moment, probably like 5 minutes in, when finally I feel like I've hit my rhythm, that music plays. Mm-hmm. And I think, yeah. And then about 2 minutes later, I'm sucking wind, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that didn't last. But, it's inspiring. A story like that, if it's well told, will find an audience, and people will love it. But I do think that Hollywood, they're going to go, okay, that only grossed, say, I have no idea how much money it grossed back in the 1980s, but they would do the equivalent for what it would gross now, and they'd say, that's not good enough. We want to make more money. And so they might make a movie like that now.
Yeah.
Because even though it won Academy Awards, they're going to be worried about, how much money they're going to make.
Yeah, return on investment.
Yeah. Interesting. You're talking about running on the beach, and I got to share this one with you as the old man in the room. My niece was trying out for the soccer team for her school in Pittsburgh. She's a freshman up there and was trying out for girls soccer. Well, she had to run a 400 in 2 minutes and 45 seconds. And I mean, that's getting on with it pretty good, for a 400. So she wanted me to help train her. Now I run, but I don't sprint anymore. So I'm out there running on the beach with her, and I'm like, if you let me catch you, I'm going to get you and all this stuff. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, my hamstrings. So about 3 days later, I started walking again, at a normal pace. But so running on the beach, not the most fun thing in the world.
Yeah.
So hats off to Chariots of Fire for being able to do that. Yeah, I think this movie could be made now. Yeah. And the drug tests and the synthetic fibers. First of all, cheating's gone on since sports began. let's keep in mind for all the Barry Bonds that we want to keep out of the Hall of Fame because he was on steroids no matter what he says. Your head doesn't swell that much, even when you're that good of an athlete. We had Gaylord Perry, who made the Hall of Fame, throwing a spitball, which was illegal. And he would put, Vaseline on the ball and he would cut the ball. And he was known for being, and it was like all gamesmanship, because it's a part of it. So, yeah, that's a part of the game. We know more about it now than we used to. We have drug tests and all these different kind of things. It doesn't change the competition. It doesn't change the inspiration. And I think it brings up an important point about athletes as a whole. We worship these guys as if they're something more than they are. Yeah. They are great players and great athletes, and they're also human beings. Yep. They're people. And we have to keep that in mind about everyone in our life. Mm-hmm. More than one thing can be true. Yeah. You can be a great baseball player and you took steroids. You can be a terrific player on the field and you can be a horrible person off the field. You can't equate those two things. And I think we have to keep that in mind with all kinds of people. Yeah. The idea of hero worship of human beings has to have its limits. Take inspiration from what is good in the sports story, not hero worship or not idolization to a point that becomes unhealthy. Take off the whatever color glasses you have for your team and realize they're guys, they're girls, they're human beings, and take it for that. So, yeah, I think you can make the same story. I think the one interesting point would be I'm betting some producer would be hesitant to do it until he knew for sure this person was clean. Would somebody make the Lance Armstrong movie too early? I'm surprised somebody didn't. Until we knew the truth. Right. And so I think that would be the biggest question, like what's going to come up later. But by then you've already made your money, so I'm not sure it makes much of a difference.
Right. We are in a gotcha culture right now, and they'd be super hesitant to be like, all right, let's go all in on this, and then 5 minutes later, we find out, yada, 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 something bad happened. Because they're just looking to out people for whatever now, just to discredit so that whoever did that gets their 15 minutes of fame. But sure. Yeah, I think this movie gets made, and I think the real reason is back to empathy. We as humans love stories that we can connect to, and I think because it was all about sticking up for what you believe in, people are going to want to watch that. They're going to go, yes, I'll go see that because I want to stick up for what I believe in, because we all want to believe in something and believe that we can stand up for that.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Well, just over a year ago when the Wild Boars, a boys soccer team in Thailand, got trapped in a cave during the World Cup, the world watched the countries compete against each other on the field, and everyone was united, cheering for the Wild Boars to make it out of the cave alive. It was gripping, a wonderful story, and every element that makes story memorable. Had that conflict that you were talking about, Brendan. We weren't sure. But then, we also have this past summer, the USA women claimed that World Cup for the second year, and everyone was glued to the TV. So, Tom, what are some other real-life sports stories that have united the world in times of division?
Well, one of the things that I want to point out about the Wild Boars, was that not something that put sports in true perspective for us?
Yeah, it did.
Yes, we're on this travel soccer team. We want to win. And then all of a sudden I just hope we can get these kids out of this cave in one piece. Right. And what an amazing story. That whole thing was just phenomenal. And you're like, if you can get a camera in there, why can't we go get them? There's got to be a way. They were like, no, there's not. And so that was just kind of an amazing perspective piece for us while we're cheering the World Cup and it's going on. Yeah. And you can't say it united the world. Mm-hmm. I think those are exceptional that unite the entire world. But the one that I remember for the United States was obviously the 1980 Miracle on Ice.
Absolutely.
And in spite of the fact that most of you are not old enough to remember that, I watched that on TV as a kid. And that was a time when America was at its worst. We had the hostages in Iran. As much as we may see it now, at that point, I think just the depression over the country was as bad as at any time since I've been alive. And gosh, we don't know what's going on with the Russians, our government, our economy is a mess. And when those kids, and they were kids, they were college age kids, and the Russians They had won 63 games in a row. And people forget that they beat the NHL All-Stars 8-0 in a game before they played the U.S. And to win that game and to see highlights, they didn't even show it on television because they thought the U.S. was going to get killed.
Right.
And all of a sudden they're cutting back to highlights of America winning. And I just remember thinking this is the most amazing thing and just feeling so great at that moment that they won that game and that eventually won the gold medal.
That's excellent. What about you, Brendan?
All right, Tom, you're right. And the fact that we have to qualify, we don't know if it really united the world because, we're here in our bubble. I was in Europe during the U.S. women, and I don't want to get in trouble for saying this, but they weren't watching. And so it was weird being on the outside and hearing everyone back here going, oh my gosh, and really being pretty proud for my women's team. But no one in England, no one in the Netherlands who they played, if I'm right, really were caring. And so I would hope that eventually U.S. soccer, both men and women, aren't just an American thing, that we are something that really does make a big impact. And I think that's, where the world, they don't put as much into their women's sports as we do. And so I want to see that improve because I want my girls that play on my basketball team to be able to play into college and into the Olympics. And so I think to go after the question, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Olympics because I think every 4 years when the Summer Olympics come on, and it might just be me because I love them, as a country, we are united. It's super fun. We're all cheering for the same people, no matter what political party you're a part of, no matter what ethnic group or race you're a part of. We are cheering for our Olympians to win. And, whether it's the girls' gymnastics team or the men's swimming team, or, I watch cycling on television during the Olympics, and I never do that outside of the Olympics. And that's the same for Winter Olympics as well, because I watch downhill slalom, and even though I am from Colorado and I love to ski, I never watch that in the off season. And so I think the Olympics is a great example of us coming together. And so I go back to the 1936 Olympics and your example of Jesse Owens. I obviously was not there, but I would imagine that was something that really brought pride to many people in our nation. I also look at the other stories that sprang from there, and one of my favorite stories is of Louis Zamperini. His story is really well told. Laura Hillenbrand's book, Unbroken, and it challenged me when I read it. Just reading it, and it's not necessarily a complete sports story, but it does focus on his life as the child of an immigrant, growing up poor, struggling with poverty, having to, he tells how he stole to have food and stuff like that, but the rest of his family didn't have to steal because they weren't necessarily that poor. He just liked stealing. And how, then he gets into sports and his life changes so fast that he's probably going to break the mile barrier before the guy in Chariots of Fire did. And so, he's that fast. Actually, it wasn't the guy in Chariots of Fire, but the British runner. And so that story is something I think when she published it this last decade, it made me think. I think that 1936 Olympics probably was just a special time. Because not only that, but you have the guys from Washington I talked about in the last podcast.
Right.
Where they're going to the Olympics. They were all at the same one.
Yep.
And then my last example comes from another Laura Hillenbrand book. Her book, Seabiscuit. The nation was gripped by a horse who was thought to just not be any good, who was really the quote-unquote underdog and was such a great racehorse. I mean, his story is phenomenal. I would challenge you guys to go read it, to go invest your time listening to it if you want to do it through audio. But, oh, my gosh, I think when she talks about, his races, people all across the nation were listening to it, and it brought them together. It's just those stories that bring people together.
That's an excellent point. And one of the other things that I want to touch on, and you mentioned it, we talked about this a little bit earlier, why are others not watching women? And I think some of the Olympics and some of these sport stories do level the playing field. We talked about the social issues, and this year it was quite a social, and it's still continuing to be social. And then what does that do for that next generation? As a young girl watching Nadia Comaneci, I'm looking at that story of overcoming and thinking, wow, that's pretty amazing. And so I think when we tell these stories, whether it's a Louis Zamperini or it's a horse story, it's a baseball story, we're also investing in that next generation coming up, because we see that with some of our athletes who go back into communities. And you talked about that before, Tom, that, when you're on a team never dies.
Right.
And so I really appreciate that idea of these stories and the unification, because it's not just the sport. It goes beyond, and there's so many ramifications.
Well, one of the things about, and this came to mind, there were a lot of people around the world who were really focused on American Pharaoh when he won the Triple Crown, because it had been so long since you had a Triple Crown winner, and are we finally going to get another one? So I don't know that that was a uniting factor, but I think a lot of people were really paying attention to that and wanted to see that happen more worldwide than even just in the United States. About the women's athletics, and this is such a difficult story, and I think it's difficult because and my daughter and Amy has heard probably stories about Abby. She's going to be a professional protester when she grows up. That's what she plans to do, is carry signs and protest whatever is on the block, and she's very justice oriented and fighting for women and all those kind of things. And she just ranted and raved about what the women are paid as opposed to the men. But Brendan brought up the point, what people are not realizing. In the United States, from U.S. Soccer, the women do deserve equal pay. They do deserve equal consideration because everybody loves a winner. So the women are winning, so we're watching the women's soccer, right? In Europe, men's soccer is much bigger, and their women were losing to us. So they weren't watching it as much. But the money in worldwide soccer, men's soccer, it's not even close percentage-wise. And so we have to remember that as we're fighting for these things, we have to set the example.
Right.
All right. So our women are much better than our guys. So we got to pay our girls and give them our ladies, give them the equipment that they deserve, the training that they deserve. We have to set the tone for bringing about equality because we have an opportunity to do that. Right. So I think that's where we start with that. And encourage our young women to pursue that.
That's an excellent point.
I had not realized the money and the power that is so much a part of worldwide soccer until I was reading a book a few months ago called How Soccer Explains the World, An Unlikely Theory of Globalization by a guy named Franklin Foer. And he talks about the sports stories that divide people. And sometimes some of his stories were just brutal. He talks about sectarian conflicts in Scotland and the tendencies of some European soccer teams to appropriate Jewish symbols and terminology, and that results in conflict and anti-Semitism. Some of his stories from the Balkans were really just dumbfounding who was controlling soccer and how brutal it was. Do you see the global interest in soccer stories as having a dark side, Brendan?
I do. I'm going to just, because oftentimes when you look into what is talked about with soccer, I think of the stories of like when the team loses and they overreact and they kill the player that missed the shot or whatever.
Right.
So yeah, definitely do see that dark side.
Yeah.
You hear of the players that are traded or whatever, however the ownership works with players in European soccer, and they're traded, and then all of a sudden they don't have like the support they need to have. But then I also think it's Lionel Messi, who had a physical ailment when he was pretty young, but he was a really good soccer player, and his team signed him anyway, bought his rights, took care of him. And he said, you know what? No matter what, I'm going to play with this team forever because they have become like my family. And so, there is that other side to it.
First of all, you lost me at speaking of soccer. Anyway, sorry about that. And, the football guy has to get the dig on the other type of football we play in the world. But, yeah, I definitely see a dark side. And if for no other reason than this, and we'll compare it to something I know a little bit better, the world of college football and the world of pro football. Almost too big to fail. Where we can kind of do whatever we want to do without regard because we don't think anybody can do anything to us. I think there's a danger in soccer becoming that powerful, that we don't have to answer for our anti-Semitism or for racial slurs that we've heard being bantered about the stands in soccer stadiums in countries where we normally don't think of that happening as much. And so we have that kind of thing, and tough, and suspensions have been kind of light on some of those things, and culture creeps into sports and sports creeps back into culture. Somebody mentioned, I think Brendan mentioned the Balkan countries, or somebody did, and that hatred spills over onto the field. Years of conflict become part of the game. And then we've had dangerous situations with fans rioting at soccer games and stuff. You just get so wrapped up in it and you release all of your energy and your anger and your frustration in life in that sport, and it becomes your defining moment. So yeah, it is such a huge thing. And I don't think really even in the United States we can understand how big soccer is worldwide. I don't think we have any comprehension on a larger scale how big it is. And so I think there's just always a danger in being too big to fail.
Well, I think your analogy to American football is probably a good one. And when you talked earlier on our other episode about this microcosm of what is to come, I think sports does that and offers that, and how the culture does spill onto the field, whatever sport it may be. It doesn't have to be just soccer. We're using this as the example, but there's lots of areas where that culture has spilled onto the field. Yeah. Well, we have a signature question here at the Afterword. Some people look at us like, I didn't read the script and I haven't seen that question before. Give me a minute. So we're going to hope you guys are ready for it. All right, Brendan, what is a metaphor to help us understand the importance of sports and stories?
All right. So I'm an English teacher. I don't want to mess this up.
Okay.
I love metaphors. I think sports are the lifeboat that help people out of turbulent waters. And then I think sports stories are the moon lighting up the wake of the boat that has already passed by. So they're the ability to see what's gone before us and go, I can do that too. So often, I read a sports story and I go, if he can do that, I can do that too. And then I pass it along to my students and I go, all right, so we are looking at someone who is struggling through life right here, and yet they make it. They're resilient. That's why I believe that one of the consistent themes in all of sports stories is resilience, is overcoming. It's because we look at them, we look at the moon lighting up the wake behind the boat, and we go, they've made it to shore, I can make it to shore too. And that's why we got to keep reading sports stories, because it's that human interest. We all are humans. We're in these bodies, whether they're athletically fit or not. We all have that ability to keep striving for better. And so when we read sports stories, we go, I want to be like that, whether or not you're necessarily athletic. And so that's why that's my metaphor.
I love it. And you get an A+ as that English teacher. You knocked it out of the park to mix metaphors.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm going to first of all say he did not get an A+. Points are deducted because when your cell phone goes off in class, Dr. LeGrand takes points off your exam. Okay, I'm just letting you know that. So,
my 5-year-old nephew's 5th birthday today, and so he was FaceTiming in, and so I'm going to have to call him back in a little bit.
Brendan, I've heard them all. Okay, I don't want to hear. I've heard them all. I've heard them all.
We've had a tough
I had a
year.
student whose mother almost died like 17 times during the semester because well, my mom's really sick, and her mom's like, I met her mom later on. She's like,
they're always texting their mom. They're always calling their mom.
That's right.
Yeah. All right, metaphor. Let's hear it.
I am and you may not like this one because I'm going to be a little more negative than Brendan, I'm
That's
afraid.
okay. It's all good.
I think
Gotta
that
have conflict.
sports are the tightrope that we're trying to walk across right now over Niagara Falls.
Got it.
Brendan, 100% correct. There are inspirational stories. It can be such a great help to kids. But we have entered an era where sports are so big and there is so much money involved, even down to the elementary level, that we are running the risk of, first of all, denying kids the opportunity to play, because now there is a lot of pay for play going on, and underserved communities and impoverished communities and minority communities don't necessarily have the money to do that.
Yep.
And we are also looking at an era where sports have sucked so much of the oxygen out of the room that we're losing sight of what they are, I'm afraid. I fear that sports look very different now than when I was a kid playing ball. And so we have huge questions about how can LSU have a $28 million locker room and a professor is tweeting out about the fact that he's having to vacuum his office with a dustbuster that his department bought. And the quarterback from LSU responds to him on Twitter by saying, "Why should you benefit from the fruit of our labor?" And that is the athletics, the sports response to the need for academics. So I think the next few years are going to be critical. Are we going to find ways to kind of level the playing field, to open the door? In big-time college sports, big-time pro sports, they are what they are. They're money-making entities, and that's what they are. But can we still keep the doors open for the soccer player, the volleyball player, the swimmer, the cross-country runner, to make sure kids are having the opportunity to learn those lessons of overcoming that sports can teach? And can we do it without having to cut reading or science or music or art and those kind of things? Can we put the horse back in the corral? I'm not sure we can. So I think we're on a very, very precarious tightrope right now with athletics.
Well, I really appreciate that. I know my daughters all were athletes, and my middle daughter, Natalie, she would oftentimes just kind of brag. I was not a year-round swimmer, but she helped take her high school team to state, and she was an amazing swimmer. But we couldn't do year-round. We were not the family that necessarily had the schedule to do that, the finances to do that, but I can absolutely see, and I look at some of the students that I teach, and Brendan, maybe you have some of those as well, where you're going, you can't do travel ball.
Yeah.
You're out.
Yeah.
You don't have money for the uniform, for the shoes, so you're out. So I agree with you. It is a tightrope. And I don't think that's necessarily a negative metaphor. It is a realistic metaphor.
Right. And when my daughter was going to be a freshman at Eastside, they had the same volleyball coach who was there when I was at Eastside, which I thought was pretty hilarious that she was still there. Abby wanted to go out for volleyball. We called the coach and she just said, "Look, I've got 48 girls who have been playing club volleyball, pay-for-play volleyball for 3 or 4 years now. She can come out, but unless she's just a phenomenal player, she really doesn't have a chance." Yeah. And
that's a tough one.
When I was in school, the coach, she was begging players to come out and try out. So it really has changed.
But then it depends on what school you're at, because if you're at a smaller school like mine, where we have 7 through 12, about 700 students.
Oh, wow.
If you are a marginal athlete, I will take you on my cross country.
There you go.
That's a good point.
Dribbled a basketball, I will take you on my girls' basketball team. I mean, honestly, 2 years ago, one of our freshmen didn't know how to dribble a basketball, and I walked up to her, and she was double dribbling, which is putting both hands on the ball at the same time and pushing it down towards the ground. And I said, "You need to only use one hand at once." And she snapped at me, because I teach at a school that's really poverty heavy. And so, they have these defense mechanisms that come up right away. And I was like, "I'm only trying to help. I want you to be ready in a game to be able to dribble the ball and not have us turn it over. So I just want you to, be able to be game ready." And she was like, "Oh, okay." And now she's a really pretty good basketball player. And so, it really depends on what school you're at. So, I see, especially having gone to the University of Colorado, where a really pretty big school here, and then having grown up in Oklahoma, where my school was 1,000 kids, and I tried out for the basketball team and wasn't good enough. But if you're at a smaller school, get involved. Go try to play a sport, because you're going to get to do it, because you aren't going to run into that coach saying, I've got 48 girls that have been playing club level volleyball. You just got to be phenomenal if you want to try it. And Brendan, there's more hope for those kids that are like, oh, I think I'll try.
I love that story, because I can just see you walking up to this girl saying, if you can learn to do that with one hand, I can let you be on the team.
Well, we've talked this time about how our culture spills onto the field, and whether that's the culture of strident nationalistic
fervor, if you will.
I guess, in the Balkans, or whether that's the need for a country to rally around, like Miracle on Ice,
sure,
or the world to rally around, like the Wild Boars. Who we are as a people and as a nation and as a world is kind of happens in a microcosm on the field or on the rink or on the court. And the stories that emerge from that give us a sense of our own identity, really.
It gives us access into other areas of our lives. So first of all, thank you, Brendan, for being here. And Tom, this has been absolutely fantastic. We have had a great time talking about these sports stories. And I have a feeling we probably need to revisit this, because I don't think we're done.
I don't think we got it.
So join us at the table next week for a conversation on young voices and young authors with writer Andre Sullivan and writing educator Adrian Burris of Greenville Wordsmiths and the Emrys Foundation. That episode is going to be sponsored by Greenville's very own independent bookstore, Fiction Addiction, where you can get terrific books, personal service, and a chance to meet your favorite authors in person. Fiction Addiction is located behind Haywood Mall, on the web at www.fictionaddiction.com. In the meantime, thank you all for joining us in these conversations about the future of words. If you like what you hear, please leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does make a big difference. You are welcome back at our table next week. We will see you then.